All right, so that is started. You are joining via Zoom. If you're new to this online platform for video meetings, please take note that your camera and microphone have been turned off and muted. We will have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. You may unmute your microphone at that time or type your questions using the chat function on your menu bar anytime throughout the session. If you lose your internet connection, log off and call into the meeting using a phone. The phone number to call into the meeting was sent to you in a confirmation email. Today's session, as I said, is being recorded. It will be sent out to everyone who has registered for this. We had a record number of registrations, over 200, so we're very excited that this topic is of interest to many, many people. I've asked Bob to introduce himself, so without further ado, Bob, take it away.
Thanks, Brianne. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I've been looking forward to this session for a long time. I'll give you the very brief introduction. As Brianne said, I run the MBA in Leadership and Change for the College of St. Scholastica. But more importantly, I'm the oldest of 10 children, and I'm a Youper. And I can sing the Youper song, which I may do at the end of this session, just to prove that it's possible, even during these times, to have an appreciative mindset. Let me begin. When we started, and let's assume that we can start. Oops. So when we started planning for this session several months ago, it was kind of a nice idea on a sunny morning, and then suddenly the context for the session changed because of COVID-19 and the situation that we're all facing. And suddenly the importance of what already was an interesting topic took on a real different meaning for these times. So I hope that what you'll come away with when we're done with today's session is a way to find appreciation even in difficult times. And we'll work toward that outcome. So what I'd like to do at the very beginning to kind of get you involved and to get you to practice how to use the chat bar that Brianne mentioned is, first of all, just use your computer cursor to hover over the Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen, and then click on chat when you get there. And then I'd like you to type into chat to everybody your name and your location. So if you would do that real quickly, just your name and your location, you'll see a whole bunch of people suddenly flying across the screen. And I think you'll find that interesting. I'll let those roll up for a little while so that you can see not only the numbers of people that are joining us, but from what locations, and perhaps you'll see the names of friends and people that you've met in the past.
Well, it looks like it's snowing in Sauk Rapids right now, Bob. That's what Scott had to share.
That's
we have
great.
Folks in Florida, Colorado. We even have someone from Canada, or who's in Canada right now, Wisconsin, and Nigeria. Great.
And I bet I know who it is in Nigeria. Thanks for joining us, Ruby. So let me get underway. I thought that would be a good way for you to get a scope to how broad the interest is and to how many people we have visiting us today. I also want to make mention of one special friend who's joining us today, and that is Bruce Stender. You'll recognize the name Stender as the namesake for our school. When I learned that Bruce, who's been a friend for many years, was joining, I thought back 32 years ago to my first public presentation on organizational culture, and Bruce was there. So it's wonderful to have him with us today, and I'd like to welcome everyone. So let's see if we can get this to work. For some reason, it doesn't seem to want to advance. There we go. So First of all, I want to talk about the origins of what I consider the appreciative mindset. That was kind of a concept that emerged from some of the consulting work that my business partner, Tony Pearson, and I have done. We've worked with uh, social service workers, in particular child protection workers. We've done conference presentations about the idea of the appreciative mindset. But the idea derives from the work of Cooper Ryder at Case Western Reserve University, where he was a graduate school student. He was working on his doctorate in those days. And the Cleveland Clinic has always worked with Case Western in terms of projects for doctoral students. And he had a particularly interesting one where he was working with physician leaders. And he liked the way that they managed the organization. It was somewhat a cooperative, and he came up with this idea of the egalitarian organization, which was what he was originally writing about. And his advisor, his sponsor on his project, was asking him about that. What's so fascinating about it? Why are you so interested in what amounted to a cooperative? And he said, because they don't look at negative things very often. They instead um, look at the appreciative aspects of what's going on in the situations they face. And that gave birth to what he started referring to as appreciative analysis, not appreciative inquiry at that point. Uh, but he learned in the course of doing his dissertation that the skill that was needed to be really effective at getting people to move to a more appreciative mindset was making sure that they were not deficit-based questions, that the asking of questions was critical to making it work. And that in turn gave birth to the idea of appreciative inquiry. Most people believe that it was David Cooper Ryder's sole creation, but it really wasn't. There were a lot of other people at Case that were involved. So, but let's start with what appreciative inquiry is, because that really gives birth to this idea that Tony and I had for an appreciative mindset. First, appreciative inquiry is this search for the best in people and the organizations that they're working with. It involves a systematic discovery of what gives a system life. That was a term that came out of the work that Cooper Ryder was doing at Case. And it was one of the pieces of advice he got from his dissertation sponsor, which was it focused on what gives life to the system. It involves the art and practice of asking questions that strengthen a system's capacity to heighten positive potential. So that was what Cooper Ryder and Whitney, his co-author in a number of articles and books that they wrote back in those days, were thinking about. So being positive is important. And I always kind of start with that. Which one are you? Are you the glass is half full, glass is half empty? That's one aspect of developing an appreciative mindset. But appreciative inquiry is a lot more complex than just being positive. It really is a process for systems change. And some of you know it as the system of 4Ds. The discovery phase is the first part, and that is where you start trying to ask good questions about the best experiences that an organization or an individual has had in regard to whatever the topic of the intervention is going to be. The second part is to dream, to develop a common vision about what the future could look like based upon the best experiences. If we're talking in terms of an organization, that implies you have to bring people together in order for that to occur, for the common vision to occur. The third phase is design, where based on that collective vision or dream, the participants develop proposals for how we can get to the dream. And then the last phase is delivery or destiny. That's kind of the implementation stage. There's a debate among people that do appreciative inquiry, however, about do you use a top-down approach when you do that? Or do you try to maintain the idea of involvement and participation? And of course, as an OD practitioner, I have an answer to that question, which is, well, of course you would keep people involved. Of course you wouldn't use top-down implementation. That's counter to the whole concept of organization development, or an organization trying to figure out what they consider important and how to go about making whatever changes or future visions need to be created. So here's what the 4Ds look like in a cycle. The discovery stage is based on questions about, so what gives life to this organization? What are the very best aspects that you've used in the past to deal with whatever situation you find yourself in? And then using those same ideas or principles that have worked in the past, what might the future look like? And then how do we design that? And then let's get working and let's try to empower people and learn and adapt and head in the direction of that dream. So it's really a systems approach to change in an organization. And that is a perspective that one of my friends and colleagues, Jervis Bush, up at the Beatty School of Business in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University, has said about it. Jerv was a student, got his PhD at Case Western, so he was always very involved in appreciative inquiry and has done a lot of writing about its practice. So his view of it is, his view goes beyond what I think Cooper Ryder was originally thinking. It is an organization development method that's grounded in social constructionist theory that engages stakeholders in the inquiry into their collective strengths, what they have, their assets, and what is working as a precursor to identifying what they want more of and how to achieve that. If you aren't familiar with the concept of social constructionism, which is kind of a postmodern thought, it is that collectively, through our discussions, through our narratives, through coming together, we create our reality. That if there is a factual reality, that's great. But if people don't see that and they have a common view of something different, it is what we construct socially that becomes whatever the challenge is the organization faces or the situation it faces. So the principles underlying appreciative inquiry from a more academic perspective include some of the things that were part of Jervis's definition. The first is this constructionist principle. What we believe to be true determines what we do. So most of us are heroes in our own narratives about the future. And if we believe something strongly enough, that influences how we behave, both in and out of our relationships. And in turn, it causes other people to react to us in that context. The principle of simultaneity, as we inquire into human systems, we change them. And the seeds of change, the things people think and talk about, what they discover and learn, those are implicit in the questions we ask. And that is kind of at the heart of developing the appreciative mindset, learning how to ask the right questions. So instead of starting a discussion in an organization by saying, well, what are the primary problems that you face? Instead, the question might be something like, so the topic that you want to talk about is the growth of your business. Think about a time when your business was growing really well and rapidly, and what were the conditions under which that occurred? What are the things that made you successful? And then can we apply those to the future? The poetic principle says organizational life is expressed in stories that people tell each other every day. And that story of organization is constantly being co-authored. And as an organization development practitioner, I would also say that if you have a particular narrative about your organization, and the organization isn't going where it wants to, or it's not getting there as quickly as people would like, you need to change the narrative before anything is going to change. So it is these narratives that establish about organizations collectively formed that either create ways for us to do innovative, futuristic things, or that also can limit the organization in a lot of ways. The narrative needs to change in order for change to occur. And the last principle, or one of the last principles, is this anticipatory principle. What we do today is guided by our image of the future. If we have a clear view of where we want to be, that is going to shape the way we make decisions today. It's true of the narrative that I just mentioned too. The narrative is used to help people make decisions. It's used to justify decisions that are made. It helps in explaining what we're about as an organization or a people to others who are interested in learning about us. And the positive principle, momentum and sustainable change require positive affect and social bonding. It's in the relationships. Ultimately, that's where change of any type is, and that's certainly an important part of appreciative inquiry. So when people say, well, how is that different from the way that most organizations go about dealing with issues? I think it's this simple. I think it's the difference between solving problems and trying to use appreciation to get to a futuristic dream. In problem solving, we start out by identifying a problem. In appreciative inquiry, we figure out the value in what we've done in the past. What is the best of what we've done? In problem solving, we're analyzing and looking for causes. In appreciative inquiry, we're looking ahead. We're envisioning what might be if we can convert things that have worked well for us in the past to the future. What might that future look like? In problem solving, the analysis, part of the analysis is developing alternate solutions. In appreciative inquiry, it's really about a dialogue among stakeholders about what should be, what we ought to do. And the last part of problem solving is action planning, or the treatment that's going to be applied. In appreciative inquiry, it's simply about implementing what we've discussed as a dream of the future. How are we going to get to that dream? So the distinguishing characteristics, I think, come down to these assumptions. That in problem solving, the assumption is the organization is a problem, or it has a problem to be solved. And the assumption when you're using appreciative inquiry is the organization is this big mystery that we simply have to embrace. It is what it is. Let's take the best of it. Let's project it to the future and see if we can't accomplish the dreams that we hope to achieve. So when Tony and I were doing our work with social services and preparing for the conference presentations we did, we came down to really two things that emerged from appreciative inquiry that formed what we consider the appreciative mindset. The first is the absence of problem solving, and instead a focus on appreciation. And the second element, which is just a different form of it, I think, is we stopped focusing on what we don't want and instead started focusing on what we do want. So in terms of a child protection worker who has certain obligations when they go into the household of a child who is in their care or they're responsible for dealing with, instead of starting out the conversation with the parent who may be resisting their intervention, instead of starting out by saying, I read the report and you became angry the last time somebody was here, and how are you dealing with that situation? Instead, the conversation might start with, how's everything going today? What has gone well since the last time you were visited? It's a very subtle in some ways shift from dealing with a problem to dealing with what we want in the future. Have things been going well? What are things that have gone really well in the last couple of weeks? Um, so why does appreciation trump problem solving? Well, it's pretty simple if you think about it. It's if you focus on what you like, what you appreciate and want more of, other people are going to be much more interested. They'll be less interested if you're uh, thinking about negative things than positive things. So they're likely to be interested in partnering with you if you're focusing on the appreciative side than if you were constantly pointing out things you don't like, deprecate, and want less of. That's another Bushism. And this other piece is pretty important, and this is social constructionism in its application. We co-create the world through our actions. So this, I mentioned earlier that I was going to have a couple of questions for you, and this is the first of them, and I may have another later on depending on how much time we have to work. But this is about creating an appreciative mindset. So the purpose of the exercise is to help you start that transition. Or if you happen to have an appreciative mindset already, to kind of affirm that you do have one. And here's what I'd like you to do. I'm going to be quiet for 30 seconds or more, and I'd like you to complete this statement. I am grateful for blank. Fill in that blank with as many thoughts as quickly come to mind. I am grateful for. And then after you've thought about it for 30 seconds or so, I'd like you to pick one or two of those best answers and type them into chat, which you did earlier. It's on the control bar at the bottom of your screen. And just type those in. And I've asked Brianne to kind of look at them as they go flying by and see if she can share some of the ones that she finds interesting.
Yeah, I think given our situation right now, internet is coming up, but also first responders and health and family. And then what's interesting is some people are talking about the elements, water and sunshine. So simple but essential things, security, my place in the universe, faith. I think that these answers are very much guided by what's happening around us. Technology, safety, security.
Those are all great responses. And the point you just made, Brianne, I think is really true, that the context that we're in does always influence what our thoughts are about matters like that. So I think the message in the exercise is recognize that these gratitudes are very likely the same things that you would like more of, either from your colleagues, from people who are important to you, your loved ones, from organizations, that when we take time to think about what we're grateful for, it signals what it is that we want more of, not less of. And it's a good exercise to do periodically. My own experience with it was the first time I did it, it took a while to really think of things from that appreciative perspective. And then the second time I did it, it got a little easier, and I started realizing, well, there are lots of things that I am grateful for. And then a month or two later, I didn't really have to do the exercise anymore, but I found myself walking through life and seeing things that perhaps I didn't see before quite as clearly. And what it did was it brought a smile to my face. I started looking for those things that I appreciate and started tracking them. And that was the start of creating an appreciative mindset for myself. So this last point I also want to make, and that is recognize that whatever you treat as important becomes important to other people. Now, I'll tell you a story about it. Um, it's an interesting story that goes back probably 15 years. My wife, Kathy, was an English teacher, and she and some of her colleagues noticed that in every class of students, there were some, maybe not the greatest academic students, but people who brought certain special things to the room. Not always positive things, sometimes disruption, sometimes humor, sometimes trying hard, sometimes, uh, you know, being inquisitive about what other people were doing, things like that. And so they created this award that they called the Best of the Best Award. And the best of the best is Bob. And they called it the Bob Award. So it started out as kind of a joke. They were going to honor somebody for being most disruptive. And they produced a certificate, and they needed an image on it. And she took an image of me, a silhouette of me, put it on that sheet of paper. And they distributed the award to the most disruptive. And then people said, hey, I want one too. And so pretty soon, all the teachers were giving Bob Awards. And um, and I started, because it was my image on the face of these certificates that were passing around, I would go into a coffee shop and have the young woman behind the counter, this actually happened, say, are you associated with the Bob thing? You look very familiar to me. I'm a senior and I have English and I'm familiar with the Bob Award. So it gained this whole bunch of notoriety, and pretty soon students were offended if they didn't get a Bob Award. And so the group of teachers started getting more and more Bob Awards. And so the effect of it all was eventually her colleagues decided to give her a Bob Award. And they called me. I was at work at the college, and her friend said, would you come over and give the award? And I said, well, okay, sure. I thought it was a meeting of the English faculty, which was 6 or 7 people, all of whom I knew. So I drove over to the school, and I before I got off the phone, I said, well, how do I know when I come in? It's supposed to be a surprise. And the woman said, you'll know. Trust me, you'll know. So I showed up and I peered through the window into the meeting room and realized this wasn't just the English faculty, it was the entire faculty of this school. And I was sitting there thinking, well, what in the world am I going to say? And at about that point, I heard a trumpet playing and realized that was my cue. So I walked in and everyone applauded, and people laughed and thought it was funny. And I had the award, which somebody had handed me. And I had all these people looking at me expecting for me to say something that was important. And all I could think of was, here's what you need to remember as teachers. Whatever you treat as important will become important. And that was the case with that award. As silly as it was, it became a big deal, but it was because the teachers were treating it as important. And that is an important message when it comes to creating the appreciative mindset. What you treat as important is important to other people. It's how they know you. So the key, as I said earlier, is asking positive, appreciative types of questions. So let me tell you what they are, first of all, and then I'll give you examples of it. And you probably will have some questions about it, so maybe we can take some questions too if you have them. A positive question is a question that is trying to uncover and bring out the best in the person, the situation, or an organization. It's constructed around a topic selected by the person or group you're working with. And it needs to be a topic that's fundamentally affirmative. So, given the context of COVID-19, that's a challenge. But perhaps it's something as simple as, so how do we use this situation that we find ourselves in to strengthen whatever it is that we're doing? How do we become better educators? How do we become better bosses? How do we become more creative strategists who are trying to figure out what the future is going to be? Can we take stuff that we've used in the past successfully and apply that to the future and try to shift the focus away from what we don't have and don't want to what we do want? They're structured in this way. First of all, you start with the title of whatever the affirmative topic is, and that's an important piece. And then usually a lead into it that introduces the topic and kind of points out that whatever you're looking for already exists. It's not like it's not there. It's a matter of finding what is there and then lifting it up and then trying to apply it to the future. And then usually a series of sub-questions that try to explore different aspects of that topic. So that's kind of the straight up definition of what Whitney and Cooperrider have said about the form of appreciative questions. So here's an example. If I'm asked to work with an organization, my introduction, if I'm trying to use the appreciative mindset, would be, I want to ask you about what's going well in your organization. Some people ask questions about problems, but instead we want to change the focus to things that are going well. So my questions are called appreciative questions. So you want some type of introduction like that so that people are clear about what you're doing. This is the organization development practitioner's basic rule of share your methods with people so they know what you're doing. And then my first question would be, so tell me about a peak experience that you've had here at XYZ Corporation. Okay, give me an example of something you consider a peak experience. And then the next one would be, so what was it about that experience that made it peak for you? Was it the situation? Was it leadership's action? What was it exactly? Was it a whole series of different factors that all came to bear on whatever the issue was you were dealing with? Tell me about a time when the overall organization was at its best, and what were the factors that contributed to that situation. So you can use the appreciative questions at both the individual level as well as at the organizational or group levels. And then you would try to shift to the future and say, so okay, so you've talked to us about these peak experiences that you had. You've told us about when the organization was at its best. How do we translate that? How might we apply those lessons to the future of XYZ Corporation? And how can we better utilize these strengths in the future? So that is kind of, in a very quick nutshell, how you would go about trying to apply the appreciative mindset in an organizational setting. And I want to leave you with some ideas and a couple of stories, and then open it up for questions. And I suspect you'll have a lot, and Brianne is kind of collecting those for us as they come in on the chat. So here are my prescriptions. First of all, if you're trying to develop this appreciative mindset, focus on, and by that I mean be clear about what you want, not what you do not want, right? So for example, in our little management department, we have different disciplinary backgrounds, and academics are known for getting into arguments over their disciplines. We all look at it from somewhat different perspectives. And sometimes that can break down into what other people outside the group might consider arguments, where it's just part of academia, how it works. The original intent was probably a good idea. You bring to bear a lot of criticism on the ideas that are shared, and the best ideas emerge unscathed, and those that aren't so good fall to the wayside. So that maybe is the norm. But so the way we would try to do this is focus instead on how we want to collaborate, instead of what's wrong with your perspective as an economist versus my view as a behaviorist. right? So it's not what we don't want, it is what we want. We want collaboration, we want integration of the viewpoints, we want the viewpoints to be allowed to exist on their own value without harming somebody else's viewpoint or perspective. So focus on, be clear about what you want, not what you do not want. Um, it's important that you recognize you play a very important role in what part of me shows up, how I respond, how I behave. If you treat me as a problem to be overcome, I'm going to show up as a problem. But if you treat me as an equal, as a collaborator, as somebody whose perspective you view as positive, I'm going to appear in that way. Part of it's going to be your perception of me, but part of it is going to be how I respond to you. So you play a role in how I show up. Um, Bush has given a lot of guidance to this. As I said earlier, a lot of his early work was done with appreciative inquiry. In recent years, it's with dialogic OD, and they have a common core, common expression of what they're trying to achieve. So he's written about appreciative inquiry that the appreciative mindset assumes that whatever we want more of is already there. It exists. You may not see it, you may not focus on it, but it's there. So track the best in others, not their worst. If you have a colleague or somebody who can be annoying, instead of looking at the behavior that you find annoying, try to look at those situations where whatever that person contributes has actually helped in a positive way, and then recognize it for what it's worth. His view, Bush's view, is fan it when you see it, and by that he means it's like blowing on a glowing ember and trying to bring it to flame. So if somebody typically is kind of annoying in the way that they argue their cases, and then one day in one of the meetings, instead of attacking your idea, they say, you know, that was really helpful, that stimulated my thinking. Well, then after the meeting, seek out that person and say, you know, what you said was really helpful to me. I appreciated that. So fan it when you see it, and always assume the best in people. Even though sometimes that's not going to be the case, start from that premise. Assume the best in people. Also recognize that collectively we create reality through our words and actions. That's the piece about social constructionism. That's the stuff that I talked about earlier in terms of the narratives that exist in our organizations and probably in our heads as individuals too, that explain and often justify what our actions are. So recognize what you bring to the table and how you contribute to that. And if you don't like the situation the way it is, own the part that you can own. My point from earlier, from my story, what you treat as important becomes important. That's a critical part. This is an interesting phenomenon. And many of you who know that I'm a distance runner and always have been, I've run many, many marathons and road races and stuff, learned over the years, especially in my younger years when I was still a pretty good competitor, that that I create the situation for myself in a lot of cases. So I remember a race probably 25 years ago where a friend of mine, one of my training buddies, had been trying to break 3 hours in the marathon and had always fallen short by a couple of minutes. And so I went there to help him break 3 hours. And I really wasn't very fit at the time, not in racing shape. I was fit enough, but not racing shape. So what the decision was, I would take him out in the half marathon at about 125, and then he would be on his own after that. I would slow down and, finish the race, but he would be on the right pace and he'd probably lose a few minutes, but he'd come close to 3 hours. So we were running together for the first 5 or 6 miles, and suddenly my friend Tom just took off. He was just charging, and I couldn't stay with him. He was running much faster than the pace that we had said we were going to run. And I knew I couldn't do that. So I just let him go. And I thought, wow, that's great. Maybe I helped him. He's really doing well. And then a few miles later, there he was sitting on the back of a car. And I yelled at him, Tom, what happened? He said, I blew up. He said, oh, really? So now what am I supposed to do? I'm midway through a race where I was running somewhat faster than I should be for my condition. And I didn't want to drop out. I traveled all the way to this marathon. And so I kept running, but I knew I was going to be struggling. So there was this woman along the course who I'd been seeing regularly. The runner she was supporting was apparently running at about the same pace that I was. And so I would, when I would run by, she would be cheering for her runner, who I never saw, was behind me for the entire race. But after a while, she started cheering for me. How are you doing and stuff? And I would smile when I went by, and I'd lie to her and say, oh, I feel great, even though I felt terrible. And pretty soon, I got to know her. I saw her 7 or 8 times in the course of the race. And that relationship turned into my motivation to do well in the race, because every time I saw her, I would jump into that mindset of saying, I'm feeling great, I'm doing well. And she'd say, you're looking great, go for it. So what you treat as important becomes important. And in that case, it was, kind of recognize the applause and appreciate the fact that she was trying to support not only her own runner, but also me. So that happens in life, and that's important to recognize. And I hope that you do too. So this is an important point for those of us in leadership positions. Annie McKee, who is a friend who I met out at the Cape Cod Institute, where I've studied for many years, she was at Penn. And she was doing a workshop out there once, and we were talking about how difficult it is to be an effective leader in difficult times. That anybody can lead when things are good. When the economy is doing well and things are growing, you don't really need a lot of leadership skill. But when things get bad, that's when they really count, where they really matter. And she made this interesting comment in one of the classes that I was in with her, where she said, a victim is no longer a leader. And I've thought about that a lot and how that relates to the appreciative mindset, that as difficult as it may be from your perspective, if you're in a leadership role, it's really important that you recognize that people turn to you and look to you for their inspiration and for their hope for the future. And the moment that you start talking as if you are a victim of what's going on, that is going to have a chilling effect on people around you. So don't become a victim, especially if you're a leader. And if you're a manager or a leader who spends all of her time or his time on dealing with people who are poor performers, think about the effect that that has on the people who are the high performers in your organization, and the value about appreciation. Appreciate the things that you want more of, not the things you want less of. So, this in the early days of my management experience, leadership experience, I would get so frustrated by people who weren't working up to the level of what I thought they were capable of doing. And I would spend a lot of time trying to bring them up to that level. Meanwhile, the people who were doing a good job or an exceptional job, they didn't really need a whole lot of attention, or so I thought. And so I tended to ignore those people. I focused on the people who could improve and who were not, the poorer performers. Well, one day, one of my exceptional performers, when we were doing a performance appraisal, I always asked for feedback about myself when we were done. And I said to to the employee. I said, Don, you're a wonderful employee, best employee I've ever hired. I can rely on you every day to do the things that are important and blah, blah, blah. All that was true. And then I said, do you have feedback for me? And he said, yeah. He said, I know exactly what you're doing. You're putting attention where you think can have an impact. But don't forget about people like me, because we need that reinforcement too. And, you're spending a lot of time working with those weak performers. And I understand it. I understand why you're doing it, but it's not conveying the message that I think you want. So be mindful of that if you're a manager. And the last part is, very last word, in fact, is try to ask appreciative questions and think about what that means. It's not about how are we going to solve the current problem. It's about what have we done in the past that has worked out really well, and how might we use those same elements in looking to the future. So I think that is pretty much what I have to say, and I'm going to stop sharing now so you can see me again on the screen. I'm back, and I'm open to questions. And Brianne, if you rolled up any as you were looking at them come in, go ahead with those too.
I don't have any yet. I think people were very attentive and, of course, appreciative of the presentation. So they were really focused on what you were saying. I know myself, I was thinking about team meetings that I've had, strategy sessions and things like that. And I really enjoyed your example of pulling somebody aside and how you communicate what you're thinking. I think that that's a really good example, a tangible example of how we can actually practice this in our workplace. While folks are thinking of questions to ask in the chat box, can you give maybe one more example of how you can use this in real life? And oh, it looks like we do have one question, sorry, it's a comment. Thank you for the reminder to not be a victim in this climate or anytime. Yes, thank you, Michelle. So Bob, yeah, could you give us another tangible example of how we can use this in our day-to-day work?
Yes. My challenge is I can give so many examples. I don't want to run over our time out. So let's think of a situation that most people might view as a negative. Say for example that you're in an organization that is financially stressed, as a lot of organizations are in the current situation. Our college is an example of one, like all universities and colleges right now. But let's think of a business that has been really impacted by the stay-at-home law, right? So how do we find appreciation in that situation? How do we get focused on what we want more of versus what we want less of? So we already know what we want less of. That is, we want less of no people coming into our store. We want less of our losing money. We want less of people who work for me not getting paid. All of those things are pretty clear. Let's focus instead on the appreciative part. What do we want more of? Well, maybe what we need to do is think about the priorities for what things we do. We have certain elements to our business. Let's say we're a restaurant, right? So we no longer have customers who are coming into our restaurant, but we're good at making food. We can do that. It doesn't go anywhere. So is there stuff we've done in the past that we might be able to lift up, to fan, and then do to a greater extent? Well, yeah, there is, because we've always done takeout, drive-up takeout for people who want it. They call in and they say, I like a burger and fries, and you drive to the door and you give them the credit card and you drive away. Well, we can scale that up. So let's think about our priorities. What are the things that are most important to us? What are the things that we're really good at doing in the past? How do we use those to create the dream for the future? And the dream might be continuing to grow the popularity of the business and to show that we're here to help society during these dire times. And so we would do that. We would bring people back to work who maybe originally we had laid off trying to control cost, and said, here's how we're going to work. Your job isn't exactly what it was when you were waiting tables in the restaurant, but what I'm going to ask you to do is run food out to the cars that pull up. All of the exchange of cash is going to happen electronically beforehand, so all you have to do is hand it to them, or you could drive it to their house. And I'm going to have a real, a large group of people who are going to do that. We're going to tout our ability to make delivery within 25 minutes of an order. And if you got to be really good at that, use something you were already doing. It's already there. We've seen it. We've identified it. It's what we want to be doing in the future. We lift it up, we fan it, and now we start using it in a somewhat upscale way. So that would be another example that's kind of timely to the situation.
Awesome, thank you. There are several questions now. So the first one, and before I get to these questions, someone asked if the slides are made available so that they can share them with their staff.
Yes, absolutely. We'll make a PDF version of all the slides that we use today. And I would also encourage people, if you have questions about any of this, or you're wondering how might I adapt what it is that Bob was talking about to my own situation, give me a call or send me an email, and we'll convene another chat meeting, another Zoom meeting, and I'll be happy to try to respond to any of those situations too.
Okay, so here are some questions. First one is, how do you deal with the elephant in the room? Does it make sense to address something that might be considered negative before being appreciative?
Well, that's always a challenge, and it really depends on how big the elephant is. If it's a real huge elephant, then maybe you'd want to deal with it first. If it's a baby elephant, I think I'd want to go to the appreciative inquiry approach first. And, get focused on what it is you want the future to look like, and really not ignore that it's there. It's there. It's not like problems don't exist. We all kind of know that they're there. But it's the same idea of prioritizing what's important and what should we be doing first. So maybe we have to deal with the tiny elephant later on, but right now let's talk about how we want the circus to get to the next town. And then we'll figure out the elephant. On the other hand, if it's a really, really big elephant, maybe we don't have a choice. We have to deal with that first.
Sounds good. And Jessica asked if we could see that reference slide again. So Bob, if you're able to share your screen again and pull that last slide up, she wants to go ahead and grab some of those contacts and look up some articles and books to read. While
Sure.
you're doing that, I will keep going with the questions here. One is, prior to restructuring a team, how do you take a more victim-driven team and apply this appreciative inquiry model?
I think the key to making any change is what I tried to express earlier as changing the narrative. So, if a situation has existed for a long time and it hasn't changed, I think the way you start is by acknowledging that situation. And if you're the boss, you're the leader of the group, or you're a player in the group that would like to see a change, to say, listen, I don't want to lead my life in the organization in that way anymore. I'm tired of feeling bad. I'm tired of coming in and focusing on these negative things, and they never seem to get us anywhere. We talk around in circles. So I want to propose this idea of using elements of appreciative inquiry or the appreciative mindset, not to pretend that those issues don't exist, because they do, but let's focus on the way we'd like to be. Let's start thinking in more affirmative terms. Here's what we'd like. We'd like collaboration. We'd like people that can see the potential in the future. Not necessarily that that's going to be easy, and not to be too Pollyannish about it, but what is possible? Based on the times when things have worked well, what are the characteristics that existed then? Like, once we worked really well together on producing a report that the state required at the last minute, and people worked around the clock to do it. Well, there was a sense of urgency. Time was important. There was an outside influence. and we all rallied around that outside influence. So think of it in terms of those elements. How can we take something that is probably there, even though obscured by this deficit viewpoint that we take, and instead lift that up to the front and say, this is our priority. We're working toward the way we want to be, not the way we are today.
Excellent. Debbie just wanted to comment that she learned a new perspective on appreciation, said that it was an outstanding presentation and thanked you for your time and efforts. Holly has a question. She liked the restaurant example. How do we do that with the hotels that have had to close their doors? Any advice that you'd be able to give to hotel owners? Bob, I've seen some photos from friends on social media of hotels with parking lots that are empty, completely empty, and it's got to be devastating to that industry. What would you recommend for those hotel owners?
Well, my belief is that to make the appreciative mindset work effectively, you have to build relationships with others. So given the fact that the traditional clients for hotels are not there right now during the stay-at-home orders, I would start trying to collaborate with others. And I would think about the things that we've always been good at doing. One thing that hotels and motels are very good at doing is turning rooms and cleaning them. If they're well-run organizations, that is a science in and of itself. So perhaps healthcare organizations have visiting nurses, or they have physicians who are visiting, trying to help out in areas that are stressed. I would try to build relationships with the people who do need housing or lodging. And I don't know if there are some areas, some hotels that might be adapted, but perhaps in an area working with a healthcare system that is stressed with COVID-19 patients who are occupying ICUs and some of the controlled rooms, perhaps move some of the people with lesser illnesses to hotel rooms or motel rooms. So I think that's what you have to do when you get in situations like that, is really think out of the box, build relationships, think about the things that you do well, which is keeping rooms clean, turning people, customer service, all those things, and then try to prioritize that when you build relationships with those who do need that type of service.
Great advice. Okay, there's one comment here. Joe says you still owe us a Uper song, but there's more questions. So you just have to hold off on that because we've only got a couple minutes left and there's a few more questions. Debbie asks, how do you deal with bullies in the workplace using a positive approach?
Well, again, it comes down to context. So if you have somebody who is really a mean-spirited bully, I think whoever the leader is of the organization needs to deal with that. But I think some people who get characterized as bullies are people who talk over others, who are maybe not respectful of other people's ideas, or who argue their own cases so strongly that they obliterate everyone else's viewpoint. It depends on the degree of bullying. So if it's a serious employment issue where, it needs to be dealt with through progressive discipline, I would say that is the way to deal with it. If it's less than that, then I think you use the same elements that we talked about before. Look for those elements in that person's behavior that are more positive and more affirmative, and fan them, track them, look for them carefully. It's not about being a Pollyanna. It's not about being unreasonably optimistic about things that are not likely to change. It's looking for something that's there and then trying to increase that thing in the future.
Yeah, it sounds like there are some clear differences, although similar, but there are differences between optimism, positivity, and appreciation. So this presentation's done a really good job of making clear what appreciation is. Kate has a question. She asks, what is the relationship between finding appreciation and finding meaning in a situation?
Well, I think that little exercise about gratitudes is really what it's about. That if you ask yourself that question often enough, what am I grateful for? It's going to lead you to the things that you want more of. And I think in the course of doing that, you will find that your life takes on more meaning. And I think you'll build relationships that center on those more positive aspects. So I'd say they're very connected. And I would say in trying to develop the appreciative mindset, you will make life more meaningful.
Awesome. Lena asked, what if the bully is the leader in the organization? So you mentioned that if it's a very strong behavior that's happening, that the leader of the organization should really address that. What happens if that bully is the leader?
That's a really difficult situation, especially, if it's a small business and the leader is also the owner of the business. I think that's a tougher situation. I think in an organization where your leader has a boss, although, it again depends on context. How egregious is the behavior? If it's really bad, then you need to deal with it organizationally. Um, I try to keep an appreciative mindset, but in certain situations, you have to make a choice about what you're going to do. If it's really egregious behavior, maybe you go to the boss's boss, or if it's a small organization and this person runs the organization and owns it, maybe that's the point at which you make a choice. I don't really want to work here anymore. As tough as that is, it's still a choice that we can all make.
Awesome. Okay, that was all the questions. We are over our time. I'm going to stop the